Hi everybody, and welcome to our last unit for Micro 2. This is Unit 19, which is on bioterrorism. Basically, all agents encountered in a clinical laboratory must be sent to the state health lab for confirmation of any agent of bioterrorism. So let's go ahead and get into the lecture. Biological warfare is also known as BW. Biological warfare is the employment of biological agents to produce casualties in man, animals, or damaged plants. The threat of biological warfare has been an even greater concern since the attacks of 9/11. Medical professionals in Congress are much more aware of the threat of bioterrorism attacks. Some first examples of bioterrorism were noted as early as the 6th century. Let's go ahead and first talk about the Ukraine and the release of the plague in 1346. Okay, this was a war between Russia and the Mongolians. This was called the Siege of Kaffa. Kaffa is now the Ukraine. In this circumstance, rats with the fleas were released by the Mongols, and Yersinia pestis killed all these Russian soldiers. Although the Mongolians that were involved also died, so it kind of backfired on them. Then there were the Native American attacks in the 1700s. In the 1760s, the French-Indian War began, and the British supported the French. The British brought smallpox-infested blankets to the Indians, and this, of course, decimated the Indians. Then there were the Japanese experiments from 1932. There was a military base known as Unit 731 where the Japanese attacked 11 Chinese cities with anthrax, cholera, and the plague, and there were about 580,000 people that were affected by this. The United States have weaponized certain biological agents from 1943 to 1969. So the U.S. has developed weapons such as anthrax, tularemia, brucellosis, Q fever, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis. And those were all developed between 1943 and 1969, despite the Geneva Convention. The Hunter Project and Project Bonfire from 1907 involved the Soviets. In the Hunter Project, the Soviets basically took genetically modified organisms and combined them with bad or virulent viruses for weaponization. The Bonfire Project was a project by the Russians where their goal was to make resistant bacteria. Okay, then there was the Colt attacks from 1984. There was a Salmonella attack and a sarin attack in 1995. In 1984, there was a cult member that deliberately added salmonella to salad bars in Oregon. There were 751 cases of salmonella. In 1995, there was a neurotoxin known as sarin that was released in the subways by a Japanese cult member, and thousands were ill and 8 people died from this. And then finally, the last one I want to talk about is the anthrax attack in the United States in 2001. In October of 2011, anthrax was spread by the U.S. Postal Service. Several cases were found in New Jersey, Florida, and Washington, D.C. There were 11 cases of respiratory anthrax and 11 cases of cutaneous anthrax. The suspect is still unknown, but is suspected to be Bruce Ivans, who was an Army microbiologist who later committed suicide by overdose. So, as you can see, we have many different examples of bioterrorism throughout history. Unfortunately, there are some advantages to biological warfare versus conventional warfare. For example, the perpetrators can escape long before the effects of the agents are noticed. So it makes it difficult to prove who's responsible for the biological attack. Weapons are often cheaper to make and easier to produce. Conventional weapons cost thousands and thousands of dollars, while a biological weapon only costs a couple of dollars. And then agents are easily procured, and this makes it a little bit more frightening as well. You can get these agents from the environment, clinical specimens, universities, etc. So this is why there are some advantages to biological warfare over conventional warfare. You might be asking yourself, is there a real threat of bioterrorism? And despite the 1972 Geneva Convention, where 4 treaties were outlined setting standards for international law, there is 20 countries that are known to have biological weapons. Included in those countries would be the United States, obviously, Bulgaria, China, Egypt, Iraq, Israel, Vietnam, Russia, North Korea, Libya, Pakistan. Those are just a few examples of the countries known to have biological weapons. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol was introduced prohibiting use of biological weapons, but it doesn't stop research or production of these biological weapons. Now, the U.S. government has stated that nuclear warfare would be used only as a last resort in wartime, but has vowed never to use biological weapons under any circumstances. Let's start with our first organism, which is Bacillus anthracis, which is the cause of anthrax. Anthrax has been used in biowarfare in Japan, the former Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and Iraq. In 1979, the Soviets accidentally released some during a weapons testing and killed 66 people doing the research. Now, this is an aerobic gram-positive rod. Other species of Bacillus are environmental commensals, but Bacillus anthracis can be a problem. It is encapsulated, and it's a spore former, and it is catalase positive and non-modal, which is interesting because other Bacillus species are modal, but anthrax is non-modal. Okay, there are 3 forms of anthrax, including cutaneous, inhalation, and gastrointestinal. The diagnosis of Bacillus anthracis would be gram stain, culture, PCR, and maybe even fluorescent techniques. The epidemiology: mammals coming in contact with spores by consumption of contaminated food, skin contact, or inhalation of aerosols. Usually this is an occupational hazard when working with herbivore animals, and these are occupational hazards of veterinarians and ranchers. Okay, the treatment for Bacillus anthracis would be ciprofloxacin, doxycycline, or penicillin. There's actually a vaccine available called the Biothrax, and it's given to military personnel. Some virulence factors of Bacillus anthracis would be the encapsulated organism along with the LT toxin, and that stands for the lethal toxin. So let's go ahead and talk now about the plague. Before we get into the plague, let's take a look at some pictures. So this is some pictures of gram-positive rods with subterminal spores and squared off ends. This is very typical of Bacillus anthracis. And then we've got the medusa heads I talked about that you can see macroscopically in the 2 images on the right. Okay. And most of these pictures are of eschers of cutaneous anthrax. It looks like it would be very painful, but in fact it's actually painless in the deepest parts of this and painful around the edge. But those are the eschers. And then in respiratory anthrax, you can see a person whose lungs are infiltrated with the bacterium on the bottom left. Let's talk about the plague, or Yersinia pestis. It is responsible for 3 pandemics throughout history. The pandemics include the Mediterranean countries in the 5th and 6th century, in 14th century Europe that killed 60% of the European population, and then in the 19th to 21st centuries where China was in the middle of a pandemic. And this organism happens to be endemic in rodents. So basically rodents carry the fleas carry the Yersinia pestis, and the fleas jump on the humans, and that's how a person gets Yersinia pestis, or the plague. They are gram-negative, ovoid coccobacillus with no spores. They have bipolar staining and often stain like a safety pin appearance. Okay, I'll show you a picture of this safety pin gram-negative organism in the next slide. There are 3 forms, including the bubonic plague, the pneumonic plague, and the septicemic plague. In the bubonic plague, there are buboes that form in the lymph nodes, and it's 75% fatal if untreated. In the pneumonic form, that is 90% fatal if untreated, and the septicemic form is 100% fatal if untreated. The diagnosis for Yersinia pestis would be culture, molecular techniques such as PCR, fluorescent antibody, or an antibody titer using ELISA. The epidemiology, it would be that rodents harbor the infected fleas and ticks, which then bite and infect humans. Treatment would be streptomycin, gentamicin, ciprofloxacin, tetracycline, or chloramphenicol. Okay, the western U.S. has had the majority of cases in the United States, including places like Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, California, and Oregon. The World Health Organization says there's about 3,000 cases of bubonic plague yearly in the world, and there is no commercially available vaccine. So here in the bottom right, you can see a drawing of the safety pin gram-negative rod, and then we can also see kind of that gram stain image on the top two images as well. Here we can see the black hemorrhagic areas due to disseminated intravascular coagulation. This is why Yersinia pestis is also known as Black Death. Also, you can see the buboes in the neck and groin, which are very, very painful. Tularemia, caused by Francisella tularensis, is classified as a Tier 1 select agent. The CDC states that if aerosolized and 100,000 people were attacked, 6,000 would die and 82,000 people would be ill. It is highly contagious, causing a respiratory or glandular illness. It only takes about 10 to 50 organisms to cause you illness, okay? Now, there have been 24 cases of tularemia reported in Nebraska since 2015. This was once investigated by the U.S. as a possible agent of biowarfare, and that was in the 1950s and 1960s. It is gram-negative. It's a pleomorphic coccobacillus. It's non-modal and aerobic but fastidious. It is encapsulated, which is its major virulence factor. The diagnosis for tularensis would be culture and serology, including direct fluorescent antibody or ELISA testing. The reservoirs for this disease would be rodents, including squirrels, rabbits, and prairie dogs, and deer, or the ticks associated with these infected rodents. It is transmitted among animal and people when exposed to biting deer flies and ticks that harbor the organism. The treatment would be streptomycin, gentamicin, and ciprofloxacin, and there is a vaccine available now called the Tulavax. Okay. Now, tularemia has already been weaponized by the United States and Russia. Let me go ahead and show you some pictures of the skin ulcerations associated with tularensis. So here you can see the gram-negative pleomorphic coccobacillus. You can also see Francisella tularensis growing on a chocolate agar. It is a slow grower. And you can see a picture of a skin ulceration growing at about a skin ulceration growing on the thumb and lower extremity of the patient. And again, this is a slow grower that takes about 2 to 5 days to grow. Botulism caused by Clostridium botulinum is a rare but serious paralytic disease. It actually causes paralysis and respiratory system collapse. It is a gram-positive, spore-forming anaerobe, and it is motile like other Clostridia are. The spores can be identified using special stains from organisms incubated in a cooked meat media. It produces a potent neurotoxin. In fact, if 500 grams were released into the world, half of the world population would be killed, which is pretty crazy. The diagnosis would be primary clinically diagnosing their patient based on symptoms, ELISA, or molecular techniques such as PCR. It is easily transmitted through absorption of the toxin or into the circulation from either the mucosa or a wound, or it can be eaten in foodstuffs like honey and home-cooked items, home-canned items like green beans. The treatment is supportive care and an antitoxin, and there is a vaccine available, but usually only given to high-risk candidates. Let's go ahead and take a look at botulinum on the egg yolk agar. So here's a picture of egg yolk agar, and you can see the lipase and lecithinase production of this organism. They are large, noticeable endospores that you can see in the image on the upper right. Let's talk about smallpox or the variola virus. First of all, the last case of naturally occurring smallpox was noted in 1977 in Somalia. It's concerning that both Russia and the U.S. have stockpiles of this organism. Smallpox is a large, complex orthopox virus, and there are two strains known as variola major and variola minor. To diagnose smallpox, nucleic acid detection or molecular tests are needed or cultured to rabbit cells or pig embryo kidney cells. Epidemiology, it is airborne spread and not naturally occurring. Aerosols actually transmit the virus. It only takes 10 to 100 aerosolized organisms to be pathogenic. 30% of the people exposed to this disease, 30% of people exposed to this organism get the disease, and 30% of the diseased people will die. Okay? Treatment is supportive therapy only, and a vaccine, a live attenuated virus, is available. Your immunity lasts only about 5 to 10 years after the vaccine, and the latest U.S. biopreparedness plan suggests a vaccine should be available and given to all U.S. citizens within 5 days of exposure. However, the United States only has on hand about 280 million doses. Okay? All right. Let's move on to our next organism, which is the filoviruses, the bunyaviruses, and the flavoviruses. All right, I seem to forget that I put pictures in here, but anyway, you can see the smallpox lesions on both the adult on the upper left and on the child on the bottom right, and it is an orthopox virus, and you can see what the virus looks like there on the monitor. The viral hemorrhagic fever viruses are all RNA viruses, and they all have similar symptoms. People that have the viral hemorrhagic fever will have a high fever, a headache, joint pain, red eyes, bloody vomiting and bloody diarrhea, and then they usually die from shock and organ failure. It is 50 to 100% fatal if untreated, but it depends on the strain we're talking about. But this would include things like Ebola, Marburg, Machupo, Rift Valley fever, and yellow fever. Those are just examples of the viral hemorrhagic fevers. There's no natural occurrence in the United States. However, there was up to 14 people suspected of having Ebola and treated at the University of Nebraska Medical Center in 2005. 3 cases were confirmed, and 1 of the 3 did actually die of Ebola. The diagnosis for these type of viruses would be ELISA, viral culture, and molecular techniques such as PCR. Humans are infected through animal exposure, direct contact, or infected fluids with human fluids. All we can do is support them through fluid therapy and ribavirin, which is an antiviral medication. There is no vaccine available for these types of diseases. One thing about the viral hemorrhagic fever viruses is that they become fatal so quickly they're really not a good agent for bioterrorism because people infected can't spread it around. The upper left shows a picture of the Ebola virus, and then you can see the hemorrhagic processes occurring in the other 3 images. Trichothecene mycotoxins would include the mycotoxins from Fusarium, Aspergillus, and Stachybotrys. I'm sure you've heard of Stachybotrys. That's the black mold that can be found in some people's houses that causes lung bleeding. Okay, so these mycotoxins, like I said, have a hemorrhagic and dermotoxic effect as well. Aerosols cause death in minutes to hours if you breathe these in. Some symptoms would include dizziness, vomiting, seizures and respiratory distress, hypotension, blisters, and memory loss, sometimes burning skin. The diagnosis is usually based on a high degree of suspicion, and the treatment is basically high steroids. So that would be the trichothecene mycotoxins. Let's take a look at some images. Here you can see the T2 mycotoxins on snow. This is referred to as yellow rain. This was a mycotoxin that was used in Laos in Vietnam War and killed 6,400 people. Now Stachybotrys is on the bottom left and Fusarium is on the upper right, and those are the spores of Stachybotrys and Fusarium. You've probably heard of the phrase, "Do you have a hole in your head?" Well, this actually comes from autopsy observations of people who have died of mycotoxin exposure. Okay, I'm a nerd. I've always liked this picture. This is Aspergillus versus Mighty Mouse. My money's on the mouse, hopefully. Q fever is a rickettsial disease caused by the rickettsia known as Coxiella burnetii. It's a pleomorphic coccobacillus and is gram-negative. The reservoirs include cattle, sheep, and goat feces, arthropods such as ticks, fish, and birds, and it is transmitted via aerosols. The diagnosis of Q fever is with indirect fluorescent antibody testing, complement fixation, and ELISA testing. It is difficult to culture. Some of the symptoms of Q fever would be chills, rigors, body aches, weight loss, and malaise. Infected animals do not develop the disease but shed the organism in their urine and feces, and it is highly infectious when aerosolized. Person-to-person transmission is rare, however. The treatment is doxycycline, although 1 to 2% of the people die of this. There is no vaccine that exists in the U.S., but there is one that exists in Australia. Okay? Here's a picture of Coxiella burnetii seen in macrophages. You can kind of see that there as the red organisms in the macrophages. Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus was first isolated in 1938, and it first appeared in humans in 1943. The last horse epidemic in the United States, in southern Texas actually, was in 1971. This is also known as V. It's a togoviridae virus. It's a single-stranded RNA virus. Equines or horses are the host and the source of mosquito spread. Okay, the diagnosis is viral culture or molecular, and the epidemiology is human-to-human transmission that is unlikely, but it is an arbovirus, an arthropod-borne virus, and mosquitoes actually transmit the virus. It's rarely fatal. It's fatal about less than 10% of the time, and patients that have V will need supportive care. There is a vaccine available. It's the V3526 viral attenuated vaccine. Some symptoms of Venezuelan equine encephalitis would be chills, fever, malaise, photophobia, which is light sensitivity or sensitivity to light, confusion, and back pain. Those are all symptoms of Venezuelan equine encephalitis. H5N1 influenza is the avian influenza. There was a bad outbreak in Iowa in 2015. There were 38.9 million chickens, turkeys that were killed, and that number keeps climbing. Okay? This is naturally occurring in the intestine of wild birds, and it can be transmitted to domestic birds and cause disease in those birds. It is definitely a problem for livestock birds and can kill 98 to 100% of the flock in about 48 hours. So it is highly pathogenic. Okay, there are two forms, a low and a highly pathogenic form. Most forms do not harm humans. In Asia and Europe, 50% of the reported human cases resulted in death. But keep in mind, only the major symptoms, disease, only people that had major symptoms were actually reporting this. Okay, so that likelihood of death is pretty skewed. The mortality rate is actually, like I said, very skewed. Most cases are not reported because they're so mild. There's no evidence that can be easily transmitted from person to person, and there is no vaccine currently available, but clinical trials are being performed. We can actually grow out the H5N1 virus by using monkey cells, and we can grow that virus in monkey cells instead of chicken eggs. Trials indicate that about 75% of people vaccinated are actually protected. So there is good news for the trials of H5N1 vaccine. Me, I feel great, honestly, just fine, not even a hint of a sniffle. Never been better. That's a poor guy that's got the bird flu. H1N1 is the swine influenza virus. There's no evidence suggesting that this virus would make an effective agent of bioterrorism, and actually our flu vaccine that we take nowadays includes the H1N1 strain. So our flu virus vaccine protects us from this. So that is it on bioterrorism. I hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget that all agents encountered in a clinical lab must be sent to the state health department and sent to their laboratory for confirmation. All right. Have a great day. Bye-bye.